So welcome to those of you who have joined the Circularity 2020 Going Plastic Neutral session. There's a question, what does it mean for companies to go plastic neutral? And what will it take to scale, track, and standardize effective plastic offsetting infrastructure? Much like carbon neutrality, the plastic counterparts will require a significant reduction of outputs. But as companies work to shift supply chains and develop infrastructure to achieve ambitious plastics reduction goals, credits could offer a near-term approach to lightening a company's plastic footprint. I'm Kristen Hughes. I'm the director of the Global Plastic Action Partnership, a multi-stakeholder platform housed at the World Economic Forum and focused on eradicating plastic waste and pollution from entering the environment through circular economy solutions. I'm really pleased to be moderating this very esteemed panel. And today we're looking to talk to you about what does it mean? What are plastic credits? And let's understand a bit more the context for what is a credit, how do credits work within the plastics value chain. We'll also discuss different types of additionality, including social economic angle. How important is it that we modify our credit use based on geography or types of plastic? And then lastly, but not least, we also hope to create awareness of the demand that is driving this discussion. So we'll learn a little bit more about what companies are doing and how they're responding to our current needs. So we're really excited today to have this panel here up and running. Thank you, Julianne. We've got your audio and your visual up, ready to go. Given that we don't have loads of time, we wanted to spend most of our time today on the content itself. So rather than going into lengthy introductions, I'm going to do my best to introduce each speaker and ask them a question that then they can discuss this important topic. So Svonica, I'll start with you. Svonica Balasubramanian is the co-founder and CEO at Repurpose. She has a vision for helping businesses worldwide become plastic neutral, and her efforts have been recognized by Forbes, who placed her on their prestigious 30 Under 30 list. So welcome, Svonica. We are here today to discuss plastic credits within the plastics value chain and the broader ecosystem. The term offsets, plastic offsets, is a pretty new approach for trying to help us manage plastic pollution. So what is it exactly, and how do we utilize such to reduce the amount of plastic waste from entering the environment?
Thank you, Kristen, and hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. So as Kristen mentioned, I'm Svonica Balasubramanian, and I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Repurpose Global, which is one of the world's first plastic credit platforms. So I guess before we really go into talking about plastic offsets, maybe it would help to contextualize the idea of plastic credits a little bit, and how it kind of, paints the ecosystem and brings it together. So on a kind of macro level, I think it was last month, there was this really amazing report by the Pew Trust and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation called Breaking the Plastic Wave that talked about how, by 2040, we are set to triple the amount of plastic that we are leaking out into the environment. And I think that issue of like marine plastic pollution and plastic pollution in general, I think we all understand that. And I think as a community, that's probably something that we've been quite successful in getting the word out about, and people, businesses, consumers alike get that. But the same report talks about how we already have the solutions, both upstream and downstream, to reduce that number by 80% if we were just, I guess, put the funding into places that really mattered and places that really needed it. And that's where things get a little bit challenging, right? Because I think that concept is a little bit harder to understand. So if you are a CPG brand, or you're some kind of business, or even an individual consumer, that's not in your wheelhouse to understand where to put the money and how to price it and things like that. So what plastic credits does, kind of this idea of this innovative new financing instrument, is that we make it accessible, where we are able to develop a project and find out if it's truly additional, and then put a price on it, because then all of a sudden anybody can come in and purchase that impact, so to speak. Anybody can come in and fund it and catalyze it, because there is this idea that, hey, if I put $1 in, there is this quantifiable amount of impact that I can get out of it. So that's plastic credits, I guess. And now when we talk about plastic offsets, it's one of the application of I guess, plastic credits, where you can say, so repurpose, if you look at the ecosystem, we sit in the middle as that ecosystem enabler, and we have our impact projects that we develop on the one side, these interventions that can create long-term systemic change, and then on the other side, we have our businesses and consumers that are then able to fund that change through many different things, like the plastic neutral certification, like the impact guarantee program, or even, for circularity, repurpose is actually offsetting the equivalent of 100 pouches, plastic pouches for every attendee. So these kinds of things become possible because, we've been able to use plastic credits to make that impact a little bit more accessible.
Great, that's really insightful. And actually, we had a question come in from the audience. So if we have a bit of time, it might be interesting to talk through some of the projects that you have funded, both from the offset perspective, but also, as you say, some on the ground projects you're investing in. In the meantime, I'd like to now turn to Julianne Brody of Vera. Vera has created, as I understand, a crediting program that issues plastics credits in a way to offset plastic creation. So companies can approach neutrality in a step-by-step process. Building off of Svanika's points about the plastics value chain and this approach to plastics credits, there's sometimes a worry that bubbles up from some that implementing these credits merely supports the continued production of virgin plastics. What would you say about that?
Thanks, Kristen and Svanika and Nick and everyone at Circularity for having Vera be part of your conference. So as Kristen said, my organization, Vera, has been with the support of the RRR Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder group that aims to catalyze corporate leadership to both reduce plastic waste through internal and supply chain actions, and then also support recovery and recycling outside of the value chain. We have we've developed a plastic waste reduction standard with groups like Repurpose and others in a multi-stakeholder standard development, highly regulated process that will hopefully launch in early 2021. So we don't have any projects registered yet, but they will be able to use this standard to issue plastic credits. And we therefore, of course, support the use of plastic credits by companies to reduce the waste that they can't reduce within their own value chain. But that's the important part. We support the use of plastic credits in this mitigation hierarchy, where at the same time as they're using plastic credits to, if you will, offset the waste that they can't reduce themselves, they're also working to reduce waste, and where it is environmentally sensible, reduce the amount of plastic that they use. Where they can't reduce the plastic, that they're investing in reuse models, where they can increase recycled content, that they're doing that, and then also that they're engaging in recovery or recycling within their own value chains before they go to looking at plastic credits outside of their value chains. So the goal of plastic credits issued under the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard, which I'll drop a link to in the chat now, is to accelerate and scale up the removal of plastic outside of companies' value chains, because we know that companies are already making claims about zero plastic waste and one in, one out, and we know that they can't get there just using their own actions. So if they can invest in plastic credits to help them get to zero plastic waste or something, or that is a net positive in our eyes, and it will help brands achieve a level of corporate plastic leadership that would add a great deal of value to their brands. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And thank you for that, Julie, because it sounds like, it's not something we can just change overnight, right? So how do we address these value chains in a step-by-step process? And standardization can help get us there. So thank you. And there were, again, a few questions in the chat, some that we might even get to in a little while. So thanks, and please keep those coming in. In the meantime, I'm going to turn over to Nick McCulloch, who is with Rubicon. Rubicon's goal is to end waste. Which of course most of us like hearing these days. And we understand Rubicon is a software company that provides smart waste and recycling solutions for businesses and governments worldwide. So Nick, we turn our attention now to the demand side of the equation. What is the role for business in this effort? And how can plastic credits help support your efforts and those of Rubicon as you aim to eliminate waste around the world?
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. And I think Julianne, touched on this as well. Businesses really need to be, from a financial standpoint, the driver of kind of the plastic neutral movement. Just as we recognize they need to be, a central player in advancing recycling infrastructure build out so that, they can capture within their own value chains more plastic. I think, I was recently reading an article about the global plastic audit that was conducted, and it said something like 45% of plastics that were identified came from consumer brands. So we all recognize this, and we're seeing, I think, as a consequence, a lot of companies taking stands and making these ambitious goals. I think in terms of what we would like to see in terms of business participation in the plastic offsets, obviously we'd like to see more businesses signing up for it, for plastic offsets. We think it's a good way for businesses to bypass some of the infrastructural or kind of systemic challenges and barriers that they face right now, and guarantee fulfillment of a specific quantitative goal. So from our standpoint, it's a really great way for some of our customers to, as Julianne mentioned, kind of achieve a plastic neutrality target while at the same time contributing or participating in the build out of the necessary infrastructure to really support kind of a sustainable circular economy.
No, that's really great. Thanks, Nick. And it sounds like you say 45% of a plastic waste coming from consumer brands. So I know we've got a few of them joining us today and listening in. And many of them are stepping up. So hopefully through the work you're doing and the work that Julie's leading and Repurpose, we can bring more brands into the fold. Turning back to Svanika and Julie, interestingly enough, John Cook asked us a question from the audience around how do we approach plastic credits appropriately? In other words, when additionality comes into play and we think about accounting standards, is it the same for everyone? And if not, how should we look to differentiate? John, I'm taking a play on your questions there, but adding a bit to that. And I think it'd be great to hear from you. Perhaps, Svanika, you can lead off with that.
Definitely. And I think Julianne touched on this a little bit before, but the work we're doing with Vera and the RRR initiative is, I think, trying to address the very same questions, where we have this trade-off between where we want to keep, have a standardized approach to this, have like a systemic approach to how we're thinking about plastic credits and keep it accessible. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the impact is genuinely happening and in the highest form possible. And the big idea there, as the question mentioned as well, is this concept of additionality, of like the 100% additionality, because as we all know, all plastic is not created equal, and all regions around the world don't necessarily have the same baseline levels of, say, plastic recovery and recycling. So to take an example to illustrate the point, so one of our core partners in Kenya is this organization called Taka Taka, this waste management organization. organization, and they recently created Nairobi's first thermoformed PP recycling plant that was massively additional because what it was able to do was, all of a sudden create an end market for this material that otherwise would have been dumped or landfill, but now it can be collected and it can be processed and recycled and so on. But if we were to take kind of the exact same model and ask one of our partners in India or Indonesia to replicate it, it might not meet that additionality test anymore because a lot of those countries already have a pretty vibrant ecosystem around the material, around thermoform PP recycling and so on. So I think it is important to kind of make sure that we create a framework that does tests for these and that has a good criteria that need to be met before plastic credits can be set to be generated. And I think that's why the work Vera is doing and the 3RI is doing is so massively important, because what we want to make sure is that we shouldn't just be subsidizing the status quo, right? We need to be investing in systemic long-term infrastructure and solutions that are more than just a Band-Aid for today.
Great, thanks, Monica. And Julie, I'll ask you the same question, but also building on that. Again, we had a question from the audience which tweaks this a little bit, but speaks a lot to the heart of what Vera are doing. And it's, whether or not is there already a regulation, or are there some driving forces behind standardizing our approach to this space?
Sure. So building off of what Svanika said, I think I agree with your points totally. And so the only way that the way that plastic credits are accounted for should be make sure that they are all of high quality and ensure that they all have great integrity. And so some of the factors in that are additionality. Others are that they are used in a way that aligns, and I noted some comments in the chat too about aligning with different material types or plastic types and packaging types and the same geography. So that's up to the companies. The credits that are generated under the plastic waste reduction standard will be identified in the serial number as where they're collected, the geography and the material type. So but it's up to the companies to match that with their use of plastic. And so, Kristen, to the question that you asked, I think that this is all in the voluntary sector so far, and we're seeing only leading corporates really have major commitments in this area. And so if we get ahead of this with one standard, having a global standard to ensure the consistency of metrics and quality and the same unit, that's going to really help corporates when regulation comes around that could perhaps borrow from some of these the characteristics of the credits in these voluntary spaces. And then we know from the carbon world, for example, that companies that get ahead on that are leading companies will try to get ahead by using voluntary systems before they get regulated. So it's exciting to see how many corporates seem to be coalescing around the plastic waste reduction standard. So it's exciting for us, at least. So yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like it's a great movement that you're getting towards that consistency and harmonization of metrics. And also really interesting when you talk about the way the credits are used, which makes me shift a little bit back to Nick. Nick, is there a fear for misusing credits? How do we ensure that this is not just another greenwashing exercise for some companies who aren't as forward-looking as Julianne was just explaining?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, a similar fear as there is with, or has been with carbon offsets that, as we were talking about earlier, that plastic offsets may be used just to subsidize the status quo and the production of virgin plastics. I think, the key there is that it's not being done in absence of those kind of bigger infrastructural projects that will really kind of allow for, like I said, a more sustainable circular capture and flow of those plastics. So I think we're seeing that. We're seeing many more companies signing onto partnerships with the recycling partnership, whether it's PepsiCo or or Kira Green Mountain. So I have high hopes for the plastics offsets that I think as an intermediate kind of solution while we build out what will take 5 to 10 years in a domestic infrastructure that will be able to support our recyclable goals, that plastic offsets really do kind of present a good option for companies to achieve those sustainability goals, or at least do no harm in the meantime.
It helps to get them started, right? And maybe, like Julie was saying, you get a few out there out front, and then the standards come, the regulations come, and then everybody else has to step up too. Turning back to a slightly different take on all of this, I wanted to turn maybe to Julianne first, and maybe Svanika if we have time. But thinking about addressing plastic waste and pollution, we also understand that obviously these credits will have a massive impact on the environment. But what are the social impacts of your efforts, and how can we also think about the social implications of what's going on?
Yeah, thanks. So the standard has built into it a social and environmental safeguards, and the social protections address things like labor and working conditions, and not displacing jobs or employment for folks that are waste pickers or others, things like that. So it has the potential to not only increase the amount of plastic that's actually going to the environment and get it into the recycling stream, but also to have significant impacts on the ground. And yeah, so maybe Svanika can talk a little bit about what your projects are doing, but we know that a lot of these projects not only work with waste pickers, but also involve the marginalized and other marginalized and disadvantaged groups. So.
No, thank you. And actually, that's a very good point. Svanika, earlier today, somebody also asked, what kinds of projects does Repurpose fund? And so it'd be interesting to also think about what are the social impacts that you're able to create out of all of this work.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is actually incredibly difficult to disconnect the environmental from the socioeconomic in a lot of the places that we work in and a lot of the projects that we fund, because the informal recycling industry, the informal waste management industry is quite vibrant in how it is structured today, but also quite exploitative. And so if we're going in and creating formal structures, there inherently needs to be some sort of system to also manage the socioeconomic components of that. So I think today it's something like about 2% of the world's poorest people work in waste management. And especially when you go into countries like India, Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil, and so on. So a lot of our projects is in the global south. They work very heavily with the informal workers and the informal waste pickers. And a lot of times what we've seen when we go into one of these new regions is that it is kind of a cyclical poverty trap, where when something is informal, the waste pickers don't have stable wages. And when they don't have that stability, they move around a lot, which means, say, for example, their children can't go to school because you can't switch schools every 2 months and go to a new city and start somewhere new. And so then they're hanging out at home, which is where the waste picking happens. And then they become waste pickers themselves. And you get this kind of like cyclical rotational thing, which is where I think when we formalize the environmental aspect of it, what we also need to be doing and what we do is say we're going to provide stable wages, so you don't have to guess where your income is going to come from the next month, and we're going to make it fair. We're going to make it so that you are able to access everything that you need to, including education. You have a safety net to fall back on in case you have emergencies, you have some sort of like accident or medical emergency. And there's also this financial inclusion piece of it, where a lot of the the waste workers, the waste pickers that we work with, this is the first time that they've ever had to open a bank account, for example, or get like any sort of formal documentation. And so all of this, I think, has ripple effects in the rest of their lives as well, in terms of like their ability to have socioeconomic upward mobility. So I do think it's kind of it does have to go hand in hand, and then it's impossible to do one without doing the other. And the one thing that we also try to do at the same time is not make these decisions disconnected. I mean, these decisions, the things that we're talking about right now has the potential to impact millions of lives. And so we need to be taking into consideration their voices as well. So Repurpose has this kind of idea of a reality seat every time we go into a region and create, have discussions and negotiations, where this reality seat is basically giving representation to these workers on the ground and asking them for their ideas and their opinions and their input, so that it can be a holistic program that is being built in. So you have environmental additionality, but you also have that socioeconomic kind of additionality, or the piece that you're building into it.
No, it's really interesting. Rachel in the comments mentioned, plastic is in our face. We see it every day, and therefore the importance for standards is even heightened, right? But we don't all understand the social. We don't see some of these, the invisible, the most vulnerable in the community, through the informal sector and those waste pickers. So it's terrific what you're doing to try to formalize and support them. And again, complementing Julie's work to try to bring forward standards. So we've got about 2 minutes left. I'll give everybody another 45 seconds to answer one last question. It's kind of similar to everything else we've been talking about, but came in a little bit from the audience in the sense that, what are some of the challenges with credit? So again, I'm giving you all 45 seconds to answer this massive question, but how do we manage this to ensure that credits actually make companies work, versus back to the greenwashing question to Nick, but what are some of the challenges we also see with credits? Maybe I'll start with you, Nick, let you think about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge for companies with plastic credits is to avoid being seen as, again, a way of subsidizing, their current behavior and, in that sense, impeding the momentum forward. I think, consequently, companies need to make sure that they're supporting the evolution and advancement of recycling infrastructure, of customer engagement, of growing awareness of the plastics crisis, simultaneously as they're in something like the plastics neutrality movement. So I think as long as you're an organization that is sincerely committed to that transformation of the recycling infrastructure and recycling practices and the circular economy, that you'll be okay. But if it's all you're doing, and you're again trying to subsidize plastic production as it stands currently, that it's bound to be seen as a liability for you.
Great, thank you for that. Julie, any last 30 seconds on the challenges or opportunities of credits?
Sure. I agree with everything that Nick just said. I would go back to the mitigation hierarchy and how plastic credit shouldn't be used alone. And Danielle has brought up this point in the comments that that no company should be using plastic credits alone, and that could lead to backlash. I just wanted to point out that the RRR initiative is also involved in this development of guidelines for leadership in corporate plastic accounting, which will set out the mitigation hierarchy for these and set out best practices for companies who want to use plastic credits to achieve certain claims, but also want to be taking actions within their own value chain. So look for that soon as well.
Great, thanks, Julie. And Svanika, we're slightly over, but I'll give you 30 seconds to wrap up any last challenges with credits or opportunities.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, not to echo, but yeah, to echo what everyone has been saying, I think we are often looking for that one solution that can fix everything. But the reality is there isn't any one solution. There is no silver bullet. And we could have the most sophisticated circular systems and still be leaking plastic into the oceans if we don't have the infrastructure. infrastructure, and we can have the most sophisticated infrastructure and still not be doing enough if we're not reducing. And so the plastic neutral certification, that we offer is really one tool, an important tool, but one tool in the toolbox that brands have access to and that they can leverage. And oftentimes it can function as that entry point. Like we've seen our brands that said, hey, we measured our footprint to go plastic neutral, but now we know where the most acute problem is and what we can do to reduce it because we understand it a little bit better. So it can be the starting point of your journey, but at the end of the day, it is a journey, and it has to be seen as such. Yeah.
Super. Well, thank you for that. I hope I've learned a lot, I have to say, today. So thank you. Thank you, Svanika. Thank you, Julianne. Thank you, Nick. Lots of great insight, super intelligent. Wish we could keep this conversation going for another couple of hours, but much for all of us to learn, to build on. And so thank you for your time and your insights. And I want to wish everybody the best of the remaining day of the conference. So thank you again, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.